your memories will show if they are worthy to live. And I will return for judgment.
Phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe officially came to a close this month with the release of Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. It is not exactly a hot take to say that many fans of the cinematic giant have been left unsatisfied lately, myself included. It hasn't been all bad, but for every mountaintop, there was also a deep, deep valley waiting for us below. Welcome to Fairly Critical. I am your host, Jacob. Join us as we look at what Phase 4 did right, what it did wrong, and whether or not Phase 5 will learn from it. To help us gain an understanding of what went wrong in Phase 4, I think it would be helpful to look at the journey that the Infinity Saga took us on. Phase 1 started off on a high note. Iron Man has an IMDb score of 7.9, and only 6 other projects in the entirety of the MCU would ever meet or beat that number. Iron Man captured our imagination, and its final cutscene promised us that more would come. Now, not everything that would come would be as amazing as Tony Stark's debut. Incredible Hulk dropped to 6.6. Iron Man 2 only brought that up to 6.9. But 6.9 is not a bad place to hang out at. The median of the 6 films in Phase 1 ended up being 6.95, and the movies themselves laid an impressive foundation that led us into the Avengers, a revolutionary movie that took the crown of Phase 1 at 8.0 and showed us all what was possible. The blue line on this graph is the IMDb ratings of all 6 films. It is worth noting that I don't necessarily agree with every IMDb score, but they're a pretty good indicator of where the average moviegoer stands, so that's what we're going to be using. To better see the trends, the orange line is a 3-film rolling average. As you can see, Iron Man started us out high, and sure, Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, Thor, and the first Avenger were not as good, but they were consistent enough to keep us entertained and engaged. Phase 1's middle movies got on base, and the Avengers knocked a grand slam out of the park to bring them all home. If you nail the ending, people will forgive a lot of what it took to get there. Marvel had arrived. That hype led into Phase 2, which was marked by a sharp increase in quality in both character and story writing. While Iron Man 3 is not exactly our favorite, the character development of Tony is fantastic. The Russo brothers made Captain America great again in Winter Soldier, and James Gunn gave us a bunch of lovable misfits that would bring us on galactic adventures in Guardians of the Galaxy. Rather than the best being the first and last like in Phase 1, Phase 2 saw a huge bump in the middle that depressed with Age of Ultron. But even with the beautiful mess that was the second Avengers film only scoring 7.3, Phase 2 was a higher quality than Phase 1. Only one movie in the whole phase scored lower than 7.0, and the phase median increased to 7.3. Phase 2 has succeeded in taking its characters to the next level, and there was no reason to believe it would stop. Bolstered by a huge marketing campaign, Phase 3 started out with a bang in Captain America: Civil War, a film that would take the natural story arcs of both Iron Man and Captain America to new heights. Continuing fantastic character and story writing, Civil War was followed by Doctor Strange, Guardians Volume 2, Spider-Man: Homecoming, Ragnarok, and Black Panther, a movie that would transcend the superhero genre in every conceivable way. Yet again, only one movie in the entirety of Phase 3 would score below 7, and we all knew what was coming next.
Dread it. Run from it. Destiny still arrives.
That's right. What it had all been leading to, every character arc, every storyline, every end-credit scene and Easter egg, it was finally here. And while the 2 worst movies in Phase 3 were sandwiched in between Infinity War and Endgame, there is no doubt that Phase 3 nailed the ending. Are they perfect movies? No. But they are the perfect way to end the journey that started in 2008. Not only that, but it built a level of trust with us. There was of course a fear that Phase 4 would not be able to live up to the legacy of the Infinity Saga, but there was also enough evidence of quality story writing and amazing characters that they could. That leads us to Phase 4. Let's just get this out of the way since it is a well-known issue of the MCU. But several of the films and TV shows in Phase 4 sacrifice more personal story endings for generic, soulless CGI battles. While nailing the ending will earn you a lot of forgiveness from audiences, botching the ending will earn you a lot of ire. This problem was quietly present in some of the endings in Infinity Saga, but there was typically enough to look past it. Either that or the writing in the rest of the movie wasn't sufficient enough to make us desire a more heartfelt, character-driven ending. Unfortunately, we actually loved the character narratives of projects like Black Widow, Shang-Chi, and WandaVision, only to be suddenly and violently reminded that we were watching an action movie when the sky started falling, a dragon popped out of a lake, and witches began throwing balls of energy at each other. It isn't that these endings are bad, it's just that these projects were compelling and relational, so a more personal ending would have been more fitting. At the very least, it wouldn't have felt so formulaic in nature. It might have even been enough to push Black Widow over 7, or WandaVision and Shang-Chi over 8. But I guess we will never know. I think the general opinion of fans is that Spider-Man No Way Home is the best entry into Phase 4, and that is backed up by IMDb ratings. I thoroughly enjoyed that movie, but I have to say that it really made Doctor Strange look like an idiot. Why he went about working on a spell without double-checking the parameters with Peter is utterly incomprehensible. While Stephen Strange is known for his arrogance, this is just a little too much to believe. It was so hard to believe that fans even began theorizing that Scarlet Witch was manipulating Strange in order to break down the barriers between realities. A theory straight out of left field that got no support in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Multiverse of Madness itself suffered from an identity crisis, unsure if it wanted to be a horror film or a superhero action flick. It also obliterated the Scarlet Witch's emotional arc from WandaVision, something that has really ticked off fans of Wanda. But even with all its shortcomings, Multiverse of Madness was not the worst movie in the MCU. Based solely off the 6.3 IMDb ratings, The Eternals and Thor Love and Thunder are tied for the worst projects to date. Not just in Phase 4, but in the entirety of the MCU. While I don't think Eternals was as bad as most fans did when it first came out, I do not dispute that it is not as good as past entries. The screenplay was convoluted and filled with flashbacks that were glorified exposition dumps. There were story threads that did nothing but waste time. We were still being introduced to main characters halfway through the film, and we didn't have time to bond to those characters in the 2.5-hour runtime, because there were just so many of them. Even then, there were still good things to appreciate. I really liked that they did not do a cliche time in a bottle scene with the speedster. The fight between Icarus and the rest of the Eternals was awesome. The acting is great, and Chloe Zhao's directing was impressive given how much backstory and plot she had to tell. I think that is why I give more credit to this film than most did. Thanks to 2016 Suicide Squad, we have seen how a movie with a massive cast of brand new characters can be done wrong. When you compare this movie to that one, Eternals certainly comes out on top. However, 2014's Guardians of the Galaxy also showed us how a movie that introduces a large cast of new characters can be done right. And at the end of the day, saying it could have been worse or it's not as bad as is not a satisfactory substitute for being able to say it was a great film. This is one that probably should have been made a Disney Plus show and given 6 episodes to fully flesh out its narratives and characters. While I can at least excuse the Eternals, I find myself bitterly disappointed by Thor Love and Thunder. The review of this movie was the first video our channel ever published, and I have only grown more disappointed with this film since its release. I'm not going to rehash all the issues I had with its direction and screenplay. You can go watch that review if you want to hear about those. Rather, I'm going to tell you what this movie should have been and why it is so disappointing that it wasn't. This movie starts off with Thor devastating an alien army in a reckless way, even going so far as to destroy the sacred temple of the people that he was fighting for. This is a perfect example of why Gore hates the gods. They are careless and only get involved in a vainglorious way. After his loss to Thanos in Infinity War, Thor just stopped fighting. Endgame showed us that he retreated into a shack in a miserably depressed existence. While this was an excellent commentary on how depression can affect people, we can also say that he abandoned the surviving Asgardians in their darkest hour, if we look at it from their perspective. Then, after Infinity War, he just leaves with the Guardians and abandons them again. This should have been perfect fuel for Gore's anti-god fire, and it could have been hammered home if he tries to pick up Mjolnir, but is unable to do so. having become unworthy due to his lack of will to protect others without glorifying himself. After realizing he is no longer worthy, Jane Foster would arrive on the scene and pick up the hammer. We would learn Jane is dying of cancer, and every time she picks up the hammer, the chemo in her system is flushed out, basically resetting her cancer treatment to 0 every time she jumps into battle. In other words, she is killing herself every time she prevents the death of another person. She is the perfect antithesis to Gore, because she is truly a selfless god who sacrifices everything for her adoptive people. Through their battles together, Thor would come to realize that he might have been unworthy in the past, but everyone is unworthy from time to time. What matters is how you serve moving forward, and in that redemptive way, Thor becomes God of the unworthy. Even the title Thor the Unworthy is better than Thor Love and Thunder. If you're wondering where I came up with these ideas, they are literally in the comics, and they have been for years. All the writers had to do was knit them together. But instead we got a movie that wasted Gore as a concept, made it to where Jane Foster only picks up Mjolnir in a selfish attempt to help her cancer and extend her life, and gave us a Thor that is little more than an airhead and an action figure. And to all those out there that hate it when people say it isn't comic accurate, this is why we hate it. Because the stories in the comics are awesome. It isn't because we are a bunch of purists who hate change. Some of the best parts of the Infinity Saga were changes and jumps away from the comics. But the difference is that they were good changes. If you make a change to an already awesome story, and that change makes the story worse, then yeah, we're going to be a little unhappy about that. In the case of Love and Thunder, the worst change is that of Jane Foster, and it is absolutely soul-crushing to think about what we should have gotten compared to what we did. At least we can say that Phase 4 ended well with Black Panther. It was never going to be as good as the original, especially after the loss of Chadwick Boseman, but it was a solid film. However, even with it being one of the better films in Phase 4, it only reached 7.3 on IMDb, so it fails to reach the Infinity Saga's average rating of 7.44. Part of this reason is due to how much setup they had to do in that movie for upcoming projects. In our review of Wakanda Forever, we mentioned that Riri Williams had absolutely no purpose in that movie, but she had to be included since she is getting her own Disney Plus show. I'd be surprised if they didn't give shows to Midnight Angels as well. The Disney Plus show started out with a banger in WandaVision, a fantastic show that brought us through Wanda Maximoff's grief in a very powerful way. They continued with strong showings of Falcon and the Winter Soldier and Loki, and they finished 2021 off with Hawkeye. These shows were not without their problems. As already discussed, WandaVision had a third act problem, and she actually ended up leaving with no external consequences to her turning an entire town into mind control hostages whatsoever. The final speech given by Sam Wilson at the end of Falcon and Winter Soldier was understandably critiqued for being unreasonable and overdramatic, and Hawkeye also failed to stick the landing, being a bit too over the top for a show that was much more personal and investigatory in nature. But even with these problems, the shows were well-written stories about characters we loved dealing with the after effects of Endgame. WandaVision was probably my favorite, but I will defend Falcon and Winter Soldier. Yes, the speech at the end was a little ridiculous, but what did you expect the show to do? Have Sam spell out a 10-point plan on how to fix the world? Strategies for overcoming complex geopolitical challenges is not what we tune in to see in a Captain America story. Captain America's speeches are about inspiring others to take the right action and perform at a higher level than they were before. Can you imagine if Steve Rogers stopped to explain every detail of his plan when giving a speech in Winter Soldier? No, because that speech was perfect as it was.
I know I'm asking a lot, but the price of freedom is high. It always has been. And it's a price I'm willing to pay. And if I'm the only one, then so be it. But I'm willing to bet I'm not.
Did you write that down first? Or was it off the top of your head?
While you can look at Sam's speech in Falcon and Winter Soldier and say that it isn't as good as one from Steve, you can also say that it had the spirit of Captain America in it, if not the eloquence. Speaking for myself, that speech served the purpose of convincing me that Sam Wilson could step into the shoes of Steve Rogers, something I did not think I would be able to say about anyone. He was inspiring and even unifying. Do y'all remember the turbulence of 2020? The death of Black Americans while in the custody of the police, calls for the defunding of police departments across the United States, protests and counter-protests yelling at each other across the street. Our populace had a wedge being driven between us, and it would have been very easy for this show to fan the flames of that anger and unrest. But instead, it decided to move towards healing and progress. It didn't shy away from showing the injustices that have been visited upon the Black and African American communities. But Sam's struggle to wear the shield gives us the opportunity to look at all the wrong about this country and say that we can and will do better. That our country is filled with heroes of all races. Heroes who believed that, while we haven't always lived up to them, the ideals of freedom and justice for all are worth fighting and dying for. And that eventually we will make good on the promises set forth by our founding fathers all those years ago. The spirit of that belief is what Captain America represents. And I believe that if Steve Rogers is no longer available, there's no better torchbearer than Sam Wilson.
You just don't understand. I'm a Black man carrying the stars and stripes. What don't I understand?
Similarly, I think Kate Bishop taking over the reins from Hawkeye was also a good move. Haley Steinfeld's performance gave us a fresh, bubbly personality in stark contrast to the former Ronin of Clint Barton. Third act problems or not, the dialogue between the two main characters of that show was great, and its pacing was effective for the 6-episode series. Something I don't think that you can say about all the Disney Plus shows released in 2022. Moon Knight was fine, but it definitely felt like there was more filler content in it than any of the shows that were released in 2021. The first 2 episodes of Ms. Marvel were strong with a delightful performance by Iman Vellani and great character writing. After the first 2 episodes, we got a wasted main villain, a whole episode wasted on a flashback that should have been cut up and dispersed as scenes throughout the show, and a conclusion that felt both mindless and soulless. I mean, this is a show in which none of the main characters experience any character development at all, with the exception of Kamala's mother, who decides to support her daughter's superheroism seemingly out of nowhere. Her turn of stance is not earned by anything Kamala does. It isn't hinted at effectively, and the complete 180 her character does nearly gave me whiplash. But at least the characters were likable and relatable. And that leads us to She-Hulk. This channel already did a review of She-Hulk Season 1 where we talked about all the problems that show had, including that 90% of it is just filler content. However, I do want to take a moment and clarify some of the remarks I made in that video. A very good friend of mine, whose opinion I value highly, expressed her concern that I might have been demeaning towards the challenges women go through. I want to say fervently that my problem with She-Hulk's character is not that she is burdened by challenges that as a man, I will never be able to understand. Rather, it is that the writers felt like they had to belittle all the other characters around her in order to get those challenges across. I am planning on discussing this in much greater detail in a video in a couple weeks that will discuss the importance of good character writing, but I do want to discuss this clip of She-Hulk because it will help support the ideas in this video.
Well, here's the thing, Bruce. I'm great at controlling my anger. I do it all the time. When I'm catcalled in the street, when incompetent men explain my own area of expertise to me, I do it pretty much every day, because if I don't, I will get called emotional or difficult, or I might just literally get murdered.
Listen to the music as Jennifer starts talking. It invokes a sense of empathy and vulnerability as she tells us what she's gone through. Even those of us who don't have those problems can at least feel some emotion and sympathy in this moment. If it had stopped there and then moved on to the next scene or discussion, then it would have left us with an emotional connection to her. Instead, it got heated. Let me show you the full clip. See if you can pick up when the writers made the deliberate choice to be antagonistic.
Well, here's the thing, Bruce. I'm great at controlling my anger. I do it all the time. When I'm catcalled in the street, when incompetent men explain my own area of expertise to me, I do it pretty much every day, because if I don't, I will get called emotional or difficult, or I might just literally get murdered. So I'm an expert at controlling my anger because I do it infinitely more than you. So all of this just feels like projecting a lot of shit onto me.
See.
This type of antagonistic character writing is what drove this show down so far. It currently has an IMDb rating of 5.2, the worst of any Marvel product to date. The second worst IMDb rating for any MCU project was given to Ms. Marvel at 6.2. When combined with the aforementioned 6.3s of Thor: Love and Thunder and The Eternals, the 4 lowest rated projects in the entirety of the MCU are now in Phase 4. 3 of those 4 projects were released back to back, which spiked a decidedly downward trend for the studio. While Wakanda Forever's 7.3 looks encouraging on the chart, it is not enough to make up for the bombs that were already dropped. Phase 4 is the first phase to have a median and average that are worse than the phase that preceded it. But before we blame the 2 worst Disney Plus shows, it is worth noting that the majority of products that scored below 7.0 were actually movies. This is the first phase in which more than half of its films failed to reach 7.0. In contrast, only 2 shows on Disney Plus fell below 7. In fact, if you were to forget about Ms. Marvel and She-Hulk, the graph of Disney Plus ratings could convince you it belongs in Phase 3. Its lowest rating comes in at 7.2, and its highest is a whopping 8.2. WandaVision will represent the highest our trend value will ever reach in the MCU as a whole. Coming off the heels of Endgame and Far From Home, the IMDb rating of WandaVision and the 3-project rolling average equaled each other at 7.9. From there, it will only decline. Even if the rest of the 2021 television shows were respectable, it is hard to counteract the bombings of The Eternals, Thor, Ms. Marvel, and She-Hulk, although Loki and Spider-Man certainly tried. The drop in writing quality for both characters and stories is certainly the biggest problem of Phase 4, but it has been amplified by just the sheer volume that has been put out. When Phase 3 ended, there were 23 movies that were part of the MCU, and it took 11 years to release them. Phase 4 has 15 projects in it, and it released in less than 2 years. And that is not even including things like the Guardians Holiday Special or Werewolf by Night. Think about that for a second. In less than 2 years, the MCU increased in size by more than 65%. And that is only if you considered each television show one movie. Each of the shows, however, had a runtime between 4 to 5 hours. That is easily 2 feature-length films. No wonder fans are starting to suffer from viewer fatigue. To make matters worse, when you have multiple projects that bomb in such a small period, there is less time to make it up to your audience. Prior to The Eternals, Ms. Marvel, Love and Thunder, and She-Hulk, the worst 4 projects in the MCU were The Incredible Hulk, Captain Marvel, Thor 2, and Iron Man 2. Technically, Iron Man 2 and Captain America the First Avenger are tied at 6.9, but I'm choosing to use Iron Man 2 because y'all are wrong about First Avenger. That movie was great. These 4 movies released years apart. There was plenty of time for Marvel to get its act together and regain our trust in between losses. In Phase 4, The Eternals, Ms. Marvel, Love and Thunder, and She-Hulk premiered less than 11 months apart. No wonder the analysis is trending downward. I am just speculating, but I would imagine the increase in content is contributing to the drop in quality as well. I bet it is a lot easier for studio executives to focus on making 3 high-quality projects a year than it is trying to make 8. There is so much more to have to keep track of. I'm sure it's like herding cats, and that is why the Marvel movies and shows have felt disconnected. Do you all remember how each movie in Phase 1 could be easily connected to all the others? Fury popped up in Iron Man popped up in The Incredible Hulk, Fury and the Tesseract popped up in Thor, and then again in the First Avenger. This all led to the Avengers in 2012, and while we didn't know how they would all come together, we did at least have an understanding of how they were all connected. We all had a basic foundation that we could play with and build off of. This only continued through Phases 2 and 3. As it stands now, I cannot tell you how half of the disparate storylines in Phase 4 are connected, and that is a huge problem. I have no idea how Love and Thunder connect to Kamala Khan, connects to Shang-Chi, connects to Wakanda. The most obvious answer is that they don't. But if they don't connect to each other, then how are we going to get all the fantastic crossover movies? And again, the answer may be that we don't. I mean, don't get me wrong, there will definitely be some crossovers. We know there's going to be a Thunderbolt story and another 2 Avengers movies. But knowing that something will happen was never the fun part of the connections between films. Theorizing about them was. Unfortunately, it's hard to create fun theories if you cannot see how characters connect to each other. It doesn't mean it is impossible. Screen Crush has a great theory that manages to tie in Shang-Chi, the Celestials, Wakanda, and Kang the Conqueror. But coming up with those ideas in videos like this is legitimately their job. You shouldn't have to be a full-time YouTube channel with staff writers to come up with a theory that connects half of the MCU together. The barrier to entry is just too high. Not to mention the fact that the professional nerds were only able to loosely connect half of the storylines and characters together. It doesn't account for Blade or Dane Whitman, the Hulks, Sam and Bucky, the Marvels, etc. Even if some of the characters cross over with each other, it is challenging to see how all of them will wind up in one film like Infinity War and Endgame managed to do. Or rather, it is challenging to understand how they will matter in a movie in which they do all appear. I'm sure the Avengers will show up in any battle that takes place on Earth, but them being there and them mattering to the story are 2 very different things. Even if they were all connected as well as they were in the Infinity Saga, would we even have time to talk about them? We used to get a teaser trailer that we would all talk about and theorize over for weeks with our friends. Then the marketing campaign would start in earnest and all the hype and talk intensified. Then we would go see the movie and talk about how awesome it was for a straight month. Then we would calm down and recharge for a few weeks before the teaser trailer for the next movie dropped, and it all started over again. That cycle kept everyone fully engaged and entertained. Even when they went to 3 films a year, the anticipation with every trailer was palpable. Fans couldn't wait to discuss it with their friends. You would spend hours in deep conversation about the newest theory you read online weeks after the first images, or how elements from the last movie would tie into this one. Half of the appeal was digesting everything with your fellow nerds. You might think that more coming out means more being talked about, but the opposite has been true. There is no time to build interesting theories or analyze every minute detail with your friends because the next project's teaser trailer has already dropped. Heck, we even had full movies release in between episodes of the Disney Plus shows. Black Widow released between episodes 5 and 6 of Loki, and Shang-Chi released in between episodes 4 and 5 of What If. I understand those 2 movies were pushed back due to COVID, but you have to think the hype for Loki's season finale ate into the excitement of Black Widow's long overdue solo movie. There's just not enough time to recharge and calm down between projects to fully invest ourselves in the next one coming up. At least not like there was before Disney Plus started shaping the Marvel landscape. It's just too much content. And I think that is the problem in a nutshell. The House of Mouse needs content to keep Disney Plus in the running for best streaming service. As such, the MCU has stopped being a movie studio that strategizes around putting out high-quality films and has become a factory, churning out sludge for its overlord. It is similar to running a YouTube channel. The more videos you have, the more likely a viewer who just watched one of your videos will click on another one after they finished. If you don't have enough content to keep the Up Next tab open, you will lose that viewer to someone else's video regardless of how well made your 1 or 2 videos are. The problem is, the MCU isn't a content creator on YouTube. If your multi-billion-dollar movie studio is running their operations the same way I run my YouTube channel, mistakes have been made. Okay, so quality and volume are Phase 4's biggest problems. But now we need to ask the only question that really matters. Can we expect better in Phase 5? I certainly think there are reasons to hope. Remember, a significant portion of the foul taste in our mouths is because the biggest bombs were back to back. Had they been spread out a little bit, we would probably be looking at things a little differently. Instead of saying Marvel sucks now, we'd probably be saying it's a 50-50 whether this is good or not. That isn't exactly high praise, but it is certainly better than where we are. There is also encouragement to be found in the fact that the Disney Plus shows actually carried much of the weight with regard to ratings. While the sheer volume of them is utterly ridiculous, most of them were high quality. If Marvel can focus its efforts back on giving us a majority of high-quality movies, then they might be able to turn it around. The movies are what we fell in love with in the first place, so there is at least a track record of them being able to perform in this area. Also, Bob Iger is back as Disney's CEO. After leaving the responsibility of leading the company through a pandemic to a subordinate, the man who spearheaded the acquisitions of Star Wars and Marvel Studios is back at the helm. Maybe his time away gave him perspective on the volume of products that the mouse has been asking Marvel to shell out. On the other hand, we already have a look at the release schedule for Phase 5. The movies and shows are releasing so closely together that audience burnout is a continued and serious risk. Blade was originally scheduled to release in 2023, but that was pushed back to 2024. Had it stayed with its original air date, there would have been 4 movies and 5 television shows releasing in 2023. As it is, now there are only 3 movies and 5 shows scheduled to air. Still way too much. 2024 will currently see 3 movies and only 1 show, but you know that there will definitely be more added to that schedule. It is tough to know whether the writing quality will improve. On one hand, we have a lot of returning characters and already established villains coming in, so there should be more screen time we can use to actually develop the story. On the other hand, there are still so many projects that we know about, and that means less focus in pre-development to ensure the right team is in place to tell the stories correctly. I will say that I am cautiously optimistic about the third act problems. For all the bad that the She-Hulk ending was, it wasn't incorrect. It took aim at the cookie-cutter nature of Marvel movies, and it landed a couple of good shots. That means that Marvel is at least aware of the criticism and isn't shying away from it. Maybe. Just maybe, that means they will take it into consideration when writing their scripts. And as we said earlier, if you can nail the ending, we can forgive a lot of what it took to get us there. But that is just our opinion. Tell us what you think in the comments. Are you ready to write the MCU off, or do you think there's hope for Phase 5? For Fairly Critical, I've been your host, Jacob. Thank you for sticking it out with me as long as you have, and I will see you in the next one.
Avengers!